The stars were dying, not in a way that astronomers might record or chart in age-faded observatories on forgotten moons. This was not the cold death of fusion or entropy. This was collapse of a different kind, a spiritual extinction, a light fading not in the void, but in the hearts of men. Across the broken spine of segmentum tempestus, entire sectors fell to silence. Hymns that once rang from cathedral hulks now echoed into emptiness, and the chants of pilgrims had become the low murmur of the lost. The word, once immutable, now trembled. We remember a time when faith held the stars in place. Now the stars drift, and in the black heart of it all stood Lorgar Aurelian. There was no legion now, no choir of demigods chanting his name, no roaring host to carry his scripture. He stood alone in the ruins of a temple built upon the bones of 10,000 fanatics, surrounded by the skeletal remains of devotion turned to dust. It had been millennia since the galaxy knelt to his creed. He felt it leave, piece by piece, the threads of belief unraveling from the loom he had spun. First, it was the heretics who turned too far inward, consuming themselves in zealotry. Then came the priests who whispered heresies not out of rebellion, but doubt. And finally, the silence, when even the demons stopped answering. They say a god's power is shaped by belief. Then what does a god become when no one believes anymore? But before we begin this story of ashes, of stars gone dark, and of faith unmade, let us ask you something, dear soul. We truly care for you. Yes, you, wherever in this vast world you may be. So tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, grab your coffee. Let's begin. The wind howled over the desolation of Syax, a dead world that had once borne the title Sanctum Magna Lorgaris. The planet was nothing now, stripped of its oceans, glassed during the Twilight Rebellions, then bombarded again during the Wars of Apostate Flame. Only ash remained. Ash and him. Lorgar knelt in the center of the crater, gauntleted hands resting on a broken monolith. Once this stone bore a scripture etched into it by the twin tongues of mortal and demonic fire. Now it was scorched and blank, like a holy book thrown into the pyre of history. He traced his fingers along the blankness anyway. His armor, once a tapestry of gold and scripture, now wore the dull gray of soot. His eyes, once lit with the inner flame of truth, or madness, were dim. Not dead. Just quiet. He had not spoken in 60 years, not since the last temple fell. The voices had gone too, those demons who once clung to his shadow, the whispers of the warp that praised him as the one who gave word flesh. They had turned from him first, as if even the dark had standards. Now there was only one voice left, his own, and it had grown tired of listening. A presence approached behind him. Lorgar did not turn. He already knew who it was. There were few left who remembered the way to this place, and fewer still who dared come. "You shouldn't be here," Lorgar murmured, his voice dry as shattered parchment. It surprised him to hear it. He hadn't expected himself to speak. "I never left," came the answer. A figure stepped beside him. Once this man had knelt before Lorgar as High Apostolic Overseer of the Varnan sectors. Now he wore no robes, no symbols of office, only a tattered sash and eyes that carried lifetimes of regret. "I watched as your name was carved from the moons of Carrion," the man said softly. "Watched as they burned your holy texts on altars made of their own dead. They said you were a lie." Lorgar said nothing. "Were they wrong?" He looked up. The stars stared back, cold, dispassionate, no longer listening. "There is truth in every lie," Lorgar said at last, "and lies in every truth. I gave them something to believe in, something to hold to when the galaxy tore itself apart. But what did it cost?" Lorgar turned then, slowly, as if motion itself pained him. "Everything," he said. They sat in silence for a long time. The wind moved ash around their feet like sand in an hourglass. I came, the man said, because the cult of the broken word is rising again. They desecrate the memory of your creed, twist it into something feral. They say you were a warning, not a prophet, that the gods abandoned you because you grew weak. Lorgar did not flinch. Let them speak. Let them build pyres and tell stories in the smoke. I no longer care. But you should, the man said, a hint of desperation cracking through. Because you were not just a prophet. You were hope. You made us more than slaves to the Imperium or to chaos. You gave us choice. Lorgar looked away. I gave you war, that was all. No, the man leaned in. You gave us meaning, and meaning survives even gods. If you do not rise, they will turn you into something monstrous. Let the people hear from the true Lorgar before the last echoes fade. A pause, then, quietly, there are children chanting your name in dialects you never spoke. They twist your words, use them to justify murder. Worse, some claim to carry your soul inside them. Lorgar's hands trembled slightly. A tremor passed through him like distant thunder. Do you remember Monarchia? He asked. The way they fell to their knees. The way I believed, so deeply, that faith would save them from fire. The man nodded. They were devout, Lorgar whispered, but not obedient, and so they burned. The silence that followed was no longer peaceful. It was thick, bladed. I thought I could save the galaxy with belief, Lorgar said. Thought if they worshipped anything, they might stop killing one another for nothing. I was wrong. No, the man said. You were right. But faith, like fire, needs tending, not domination. Lorgar stood slowly. His form, even bent with age and burden, cast a long shadow across the ruins. I no longer seek redemption, he said, nor validation. I am tired, Marnan, so very tired. I know, Marnan said, but the galaxy isn't. It is still listening, even if the gods are not. Lorgar looked out over the gray dunes of ash and memory, and for the first time in decades, something inside him stirred. Not faith, not hope, but obligation. Not to the gods, not even to himself, to the word, to truth, as broken and blood-stained as it might be. He turned back to Marnan. Gather the remnants, the true ones, not the zealots. Marnan blinked. You mean to speak again? Lorgar nodded. One final sermon. As the two figures walked back toward the edge of the crater, the stars above flickered dimly. One of them pulsed, faint, a heartbeat in the void. They came like shadows cast by a dead flame, flickering remnants of a once blazing fire, drawn not by glory, but by gravity. One by one, they descended on Syax, world of ruin, answering a call that had never been spoken aloud. There were no transmissions, no holy visions, no astropathic screams. And yet they came. Some heard whispers in dreams, others followed ash trails through warp tides. A few simply knew. They were broken things, not warriors, not prophets, not the firebrands of old. These were the remainder, those whom history had forgotten, who clung not to the word out of zeal, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. Veterans of faith without victory, survivors of wars fought for gods who no longer listened. And in the heart of the crater, Lorgar Aurelian stood again. He did not wear armor now, only robes, dark, simple, threadbare, the kind worn by wandering mendicants in the age before the heresy. His eyes bore no divine light. There was no halo of demonic fire, no unnatural resonance in his voice. He did not hover. He walked. And that was why they listened. For if even Lorgar Aurelian had cast off his trappings, what then remained of godhood? They gathered in the Temple of Echoes, a structure rebuilt from the bones of the old sanctum. No tools, no machines. They shaped it with their hands, carving icons from ash stone, raising pillars not in glory but in memory. No banners flew, only silence. Marnan watched as the pilgrims worked. He no longer called himself High Overseer. That title had no meaning here. He was just another man, old, calloused, worn down by years of trying to keep the faith alive after its author had gone silent. There were perhaps 300 of them. Some were former word-bearers, their armor rusted, sigils obscured. Others were humans, adepts, scribes, orphans of faith. One woman had walked across the dead belt of Urania Prime barefoot, carrying with her a copy of the Book of Lorgar transcribed in her own blood. Another had once been a sorcerer of the warp, but now wandered mute, his third eye sewn shut. None asked what would come next. They only built and waited. Lorgar sat alone in a chamber carved from obsidian. Before him, an ancient lectern, the same he had used to read from during the concordance of flame on Colchis 10,000 years ago. Its wood was cracked, the gold leaf gone. But it stood. In his hands he held nothing. Not a book, not a scroll. He had no need of them anymore. The word was within him. But for the first time in his long, damned life, he questioned whether it should be spoken. He thought of Robut, of their last battle, not with blades, but with ideologies. Guilliman had called him a coward, a liar, a fanatic. But Lorgar had pitied him then, even as they fought. For Robut still believed in order, still believed that humans could be managed like numbers in a ledger. Lorgar had believed in belief, and yet both of them had lost. Perhaps the galaxy itself had never been meant for gods. That night, as Syax's dead skies turned violet with the shimmer of aurora borealis, some strange remnant of long-dead orbital engines igniting, the pilgrims gathered beneath the half-built dome of the temple. Lorgar walked in silence, each step echoing across the stone. They parted before him not out of awe, but something deeper, a mourning reverence. They looked at him not as a leader, nor a god, but as the final witness to something ancient. He stepped to the center. The silence was complete. He looked around at them, his voice rising soft, steady, human. "I will not preach to you," he said. A murmur passed through the crowd, uncertain. "I have spoken for 10,000 years," Lorgar continued, "spoken until words became knives and knives became wars. I have twisted truth into verse and verse into chains. I have written scripture in the blood of billions." He looked down. "And it brought us here." No one moved. "You came here not for prophecy," he said, "but for closure. You came to hear whether your faith still has meaning, whether it was all a lie." He looked up, and for a brief moment his eyes burned, not with demonic fire, but with grief so ancient it transcended time. "It was a lie," he whispered, "but a beautiful one." Gasps, quiet and sharp. Some turned away. Others wept. "I told you gods could be shaped by belief," he said, "and they can, but shaping is not creating. I mistook the echo for the source. I gave form to madness and called it divine." One of the pilgrims, a gaunt former priest, stepped forward, voice cracking. "Then what were we? All these years, what were we for?" Lorgar stepped toward him. "You were the last dreamers," he said gently, "the ones who tried. In a galaxy ruled by steel and silence, you dared to believe. That mattered." "But if it was a lie," a woman asked from the crowd, "what are we supposed to do now?" "Choose," Lorgar said. "That is all I can give you now. Not truth, not doctrine, only choice." He raised his hand and gestured around. "This temple, it is not a church. It is a tomb. For the old faith, for the gods we created, for me." A hush, not fearful, just final. "I will die here," Lorgar said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but here, no longer as a prophet, only as a man." Silence. And then, slowly, the pilgrims knelt, not in worship, but farewell. Later, as the stars turned, Marnan sat with Lorgar on the edge of the crater where they had first spoken weeks before. "You shattered them," Marnan said, "and still they stayed." "They deserved the truth," Lorgar replied. Even if it breaks them, some will leave. They should. And those who remain? Lorgar looked to the stars. They will write their own words. Marnan considered that. Then, you don't think they'll just turn your death into another scripture? A faint smile touched Lorgar's lips, the first in centuries. They might, he said, but that is no longer my burden. They sat together, two old men beneath the cold glow of stars too distant to name, surrounded by ash and the last embers of something once holy. He had many names once: Serenus Vael, Keeper of the Spiral Codex, Ardent Fang of the 13th Temple, the Seer of Athon Prime, titles and roles stacked like armor, not to shield, but to separate. Between the names, between the syllables of doctrine and the rattling litanies of 1,000 forgotten congregations, the man had long since ceased to exist. Now he had only one name: Blind. The warp had taken his sight in an instant, decades ago. Not through punishment, but revelation. He had peered too deep, drawn too near the raw psionic core of the 8th scripture, the apocryphal tome none dared speak of even among the word-bearers. It had shown him something that made his eyes burn away in their sockets. He did not scream. He simply closed the book and walked into exile. Now he walked again, into Syax. His approach was not heralded. There were no storms in the warp this time, no demonic murmur or crashing of spirit across veil. He simply arrived, robe soaked in void mist, his feet bare and calloused. The skin of his face was marked with old ritual scars, but now weathered by time into soft, almost human wrinkles. His eyes were sealed by black thread, a permanent wound. He used no cane, no servo guide, and yet he never stumbled. They found him standing at the perimeter of the Temple of Echoes, unmoving, as if waiting for the ground itself to speak first. The first to greet him was Ilith Var, a former legionary with silver in his voice and soot in his armor joints. He had fought in the Corivaldi incursion, led zealots across 10 systems, and once held a shrine world hostage for a single line of scripture. He looked at the blind seer and did not speak. The blind spoke first. I felt the silence, he said softly, and I came to witness its voice. You came to bury the god, Ilith asked. The seer smiled, a thin, trembling thing. I came to see if he still casts a shadow. When Lorgar met him, it was not in the temple, but far beyond it, where the sky was empty and the ground remembered fire. They stood on the edge of the Vothian scar, a wound in Syax's crust from when orbital weapons had peeled the mantle open like skin. Wind sang through the ravine like a dirge. Lorgar did not ask how he had found the place. Blind simply tilted his head and said, I know your footsteps. They sat. No ceremony. Just two old things returning to a place of pain. You're not here for closure, Lorgar said. Blind nodded. Number, I'm here to ask you why you stopped. The words were knives, not cruel, but surgical. Lorgar was silent. Blind continued, his voice slow and aching. The word still burns in me, even now, even after I tore out my own gift to stop seeing what you showed me. You believe it still? Lorgar asked, half incredulous. I don't believe it, Blind said. I need it. A pause. Lorgar stared across the wastes where dark clouds gathered but never rained. I built a god out of need too, he said finally. But it was never meant to last. Not really. Blind turned his face to the wind. Then why was it so beautiful? Later that night, the two men, Primarch and Pilgrim, walked through the near-finished temple beneath scaffolding carved by human hands and Astartes' fingers both. The community was still growing. New arrivals had come. Some were twisted things, once possessed or marked by the warp, now humbled and broken. Others were just lost. None called it a cult. None dared call it holy. They simply called it the Gathering. Blind spoke with them, To a young girl orphaned by word-bearer purges, he whispered a poem about Colchis that had not been spoken in 10,000 years. To a former legionary who could no longer hear voices, human or demonic, he sang a hymn in dead tongue, one verse long, and wept. To Marnan, he said only this: "He is almost ready." Lorgar felt it too, not in the warp. The warp was still now for him. The gods, and if they still watched, remained silent. It was in his bones, in the marrow of a being who had lived too long. Something was rising. Not a god, not a battle, a decision. He stood at the edge of the sleeping hall and watched the pilgrims rest. Astartes slept upright, weapons never far. Mortals curled together like animals, instinctively drawing near warmth. There was no hierarchy now, no division. Only the shared ache of former believers. Lorgar turned to Blind. "You believe this will end in peace?" "No," Blind said, "but I believe it will end honestly." 3 nights later, a ship arrived in orbit. It did not signal. Its markings were not Imperial, nor Traitor, nor Xenos. It was old, silent, covered in bone lattice work and relic iron plates. A ship that had once belonged to the serrated sun cult, long thought extinct. When it landed, its doors hissed open to reveal not warriors, but a single woman. She walked alone across the crater, barefoot in ash, her arms inked with heresy, her lips marked with old prophecy. Her voice had not spoken in 9 years, not since the loss of her son to the fires of the ecclesiarchy. Now she came to speak again. In the central hall of the temple, she found them. Lorgar, Blind, Marnan, Eilith, and the last of the faithful. They did not know her name, she gave none. But when she opened her mouth, they knew the truth. She spoke the same opening lines that Lorgar had once uttered on the fields of Kur, beneath twin suns when he was still mortal. "We do not kneel because we are weak. We kneel because we remember." And then she knelt. Not in worship, in defiance of despair. Blind wept. Lorgar stood. And at last, he knew what came next. That night, the fires were lit. Not in celebration, not in worship, but for the telling. Lorgar stood before them once more. The pilgrims gathered, dozens now, some armored, some in rags. They sat in a ring, firelight dancing across their faces. There were no banners, no runes, no symbols, only memory. "I built a faith," Lorgar said, "not to save mankind, but to save myself. I feared the silence. I feared a galaxy without meaning." He turned slowly. "And yet here you are, still breathing, still speaking, still here, without gods, without promises." He pointed to the woman, now silent, her eyes glowing faintly with inner fire. She spoke the first words, but she did not ask for salvation, only remembrance. He looked at them all. "So I ask you now, why do you remain?" And one by one they answered. "To remember my brother who died screaming your name. To find something worth dying for. To stop running. To see if silence can still sing." Lorgar closed his eyes. It was not absolution. It was not resurrection. But it was honest. And for the first time in millennia, the Primarch of the 17th Legion felt something he had thought long buried. Hope. There is a place beneath the Temple of Echoes where the stone remembers war. They called it the Scar, though none living knew its true name. It was older than the chapel Lorgar raised, older even than the god he once believed in, a wound carved into Syax's crust during the burning of the system, when orbital bombardments split the rock and bled the planet's molten heart. Now, centuries later, the magma was still, hardened, black glass, but the air still screamed. No one went there unless they were summoned, and now, one by one, they descended. Blind went first. He walked barefoot, as always, robes scraping the soot-streaked steps, his thread-sewn eyes fixed nowhere and everywhere. He said nothing. He carried no relic, no tome, only silence. Behind him came Marnan, the former zealot, bearing a torch that flickered not with flame, but with pale warp light. He had not spoken since the woman's arrival. He did not weep. He did not pray. He merely followed. Then came the nameless woman whose voice had awoken the old words. She walked barefoot, her hands stained with ink, her mouth stitched shut once more. She did not need to speak again. She had already said everything. Ilith Vaer came next, blade drawn. Not in threat, but in tradition. He remembered the old rites. He had seen the founding temples. He had murdered priests on Lorgar's orders when the faith required pruning. Now he walked as guardian, not killer. And last came Lorgar. He wore no armor, no crown, no symbols. Just a simple robe of ash gray, its edges tattered by wind. His face was calm, but in his hands he carried a book. It was blank. The Scar's inner chamber was vast, its ceiling swallowed by darkness, the walls slick with obsidian veins. The only sound was breath and the gentle crackle of Marnan's warp light. In the center stood a monolith, unmarked, untouched, a single piece of slate-gray stone that pulsed faintly, like it remembered a god that never truly lived. This was where the faith had begun. Not on Kolchis, not in Lorgar's visions, but here in the stillness of unspoken grief, when belief was less about gods and more about enduring the emptiness they left behind. Lorgar stepped forward. He did not kneel. He did not chant. He opened the blank book and placed it on the altar. "I came here once," he said, "during the Great Scouring, when we fled from Terra's fire and sought meaning in the rubble." He looked up, meeting no one's gaze and everyone's. "I stood here and waited for a voice. Any voice, but all I heard was my own." Blind stepped forward. He touched the monolith with one pale hand. "It still echoes," he whispered. Lorgar nodded. "Echoes are all I have left." The woman approached next. She traced a spiral with her fingertip across the stone. The ancient mark of the old faith, the spiral path, symbol of enlightenment and entropy alike. It shimmered faintly, then faded. Marnan placed the torch beside the monolith. Its light did not flicker. It deepened, as though feeding on the weight of memory. Ilith watched in silence, and then, together, they waited. Minutes passed, then hours. No voice came, no demons, no visions, only the sound of 5 people breathing in the dark. And then Lorgar did something he had not done in 10,000 years. He prayed, not to the Pantheon, not to the Emperor, not even to himself. He prayed to the absence, to the void left by gods and monsters, by brothers lost and cities burned, by shrines razed and shattered. He prayed to the wound inside him, the hole no scripture could fill. And in that stillness something shifted, not in the warp, not in the stone, but in them. Blind spoke first. "I see a light," he said, "not a god, not a soul, a match in the dark." The woman touched her lips. The threads came undone without blood. She whispered, "It's us." Marnan fell to his knees, not in despair, in awe. Lorgar turned to them all. "This is what remains when the lies are gone. Not ruin, not damnation, just choice." He gestured to the blank book. "I will not write another scripture." He looked to the others. "But you can." One by one they approached. Blind pressed his fingers to the parchment. A single phrase appeared, seared into the page in burning ink. "The gods did not abandon us. We outgrew them." Marnan added next, "Faith without pain is memory. Pain without faith is freedom." The woman, still nameless, whispered, "We are not what we believed, but we are still here." Ilith, voice gravel-scarred, "We killed for lies. Now we live for silence." And Lorgar wrote last, "I am not a god. I am not forgiven. I am not finished. They closed the book. No divine light, no sign, no miracle, only silence. And this time it felt sacred. When they returned to the temple, dawn had broken. The first dawn Syax had seen in centuries. Pilgrims gathered at the steps. They saw the faces of those who had descended, unchanged but transformed. Lorgar raised the book. It is not holy, he said. It is not final, but it is true. And then he placed it not on an altar, but on the ground, at the feet of all who came after. That night, no sermons were spoken, no litanies sung, only stories. A legionary spoke of his brother, lost in the eye. A mortal girl told of her village, raised in the name of a false saint. Illith recited a passage once burned from the imperial creed. Marinan sang a hymn in Colchizian, forgetting the words halfway through. Blind simply laughed, and Lorgar, he listened. Later, alone in his chamber, he stood before a mirror that showed nothing. He spoke aloud. You win, Father. I see it now. There was never meant to be one truth, only the courage to live without one. He took off his robe, not in ceremony, in peace. The scars on his chest no longer burned. The runes had faded, and in that moment, he was not a Primarch, not a prophet, not a monster, just a man. The temple walls began to peel, not with time, not with neglect, but with a kind of shedding, as though stone itself wished to be rid of the weight it had borne for centuries. Golden idols cracked, frescoes flaked and fell. Acolytes once clad in crimson now walked in unmarked robes, eyes open but uncertain. Something was dying within the sanctuary, and something else, something wordless, was being born. The pilgrims sensed it first. They did not leave. They stayed. They whispered not prayers, but questions. They stopped prostrating and began speaking. The sermons were no longer memorized. They were improvised. They did not chant for Lorgar. They spoke to him, and he listened. But far beyond Syax, the eye began to stir. The gods noticed the silence. There are no secrets in the warp, only reflections, distortions, and screams. And in the quiet that followed Lorgar's rejection, the shriek of absence echoed louder than any prayer. Khorne bled in fury. Slaanesh trembled with poisoned desire. Nurgle smiled through rot-choked teeth. Tzeentch laughed with eyes that did not blink. They had lost prophets before. They had seen temples fall. But Lorgar had not merely turned from them. He had named them false. He had survived them. That was unforgivable. And so they sent an emissary, not a demon, not a prince, but something older, a thing from before the Pantheon had names, when belief was still raw and unformed. It took the shape of a child. It bore the eyes of the first martyr, and it spoke with the voice of every god at once. It came to Syax on the third day of silence. No storm heralded its arrival. No sigils burned in the sky. The child simply appeared in the temple's shattered atrium, barefoot and expressionless, hands empty. The pilgrims parted around it like water. It walked to the base of the altar, where the blank book lay, now half filled with the scrawlings of mortals, and stared at Lorgar. No challenge, no threat. Just the question, spoken in a voice that was somehow all voices. Do you forget who made you? Lorgar did not rise from where he sat. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply looked at the child with eyes the color of old ash. I remember, he said, but I also remember who I was before you. The child tilted its head. And what are you now? Not yours, Lorgar answered. The child's face changed, not with emotion, but with layers. Its features shimmered like reflections in a broken mirror, each glimpse showing a different face from Lorgar's past. Cor Farron, Argel Tal, Robut Gilliman, the Emperor, and then Urizen, the name he had given himself in his exile. Without us, said the child, you are a ruin in a temple built for no god. Lorgar stood, then let it crumble. The confrontation was not battle, not in the way mortals understand it. There were no blades, no warp fire, no demonic hosts. Just two wills, one made of hunger, one made of grief. Around them, the temple grew colder, not physically but metaphysically, as though belief itself was receding, leaving only bone and dust behind. The child circled him, barefoot on stone. Faith is not a choice, it said. It is a leash. The only question is who holds it. I cut the leash, Lorgar whispered. I buried the collar. You buried nothing. You only built new chains. No, Lorgar said. I stopped looking for gods that bled. I stopped needing to bleed for them. The child lunged, not with hands, but with presence. Its voice became storm, its gaze an unraveling tide of faces. All who had died for Lorgar, all who had burned for him, all who had followed his words into damnation. You owe them, it hissed. You owe their suffering meaning. I gave them meaning, Lorgar answered, trembling but standing. I gave them choice. It began to scream then, not the child, but the thing beneath the voice. A scream that echoed not in ears, but in hearts. A scream of dying divinity. And with it, something ruptured. The scar beneath the temple cracked once more, a low quake rumbling across the planet. Pilgrims fell to their knees, not in worship but in pain, their minds churning with images of fire and chains, thrones of bone, and books that never ended. Lorgar dropped to one knee. Not from weakness, from sorrow. Let them forget me, he said aloud. Let them forget you, too. And the child began to unravel. Its skin sloughed like ash. Its mouth widened into a howl that contained no sound. And for a moment, just before it vanished, it looked afraid. Not of Lorgar, of what he had made, of what came after gods. Then it was gone. No warp rift, no demon trail, just gone. In the silence, Blind approached. He had watched from the shadows, felt every tremor in the warp like lashes across his soul. They'll come again, he said. The gods, their puppets, their sons, Lorgar nodded. I know. Blind touched the book, now closed. But it's too late, isn't it? Lorgar didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the threshold of the temple and looked out across Syax. Pilgrims were gathering torches, not for war, but for light. A boy was drawing in the dust, a spiral. A woman was teaching others to write without liturgy, and above, for the first time in centuries, the stars did not whisper madness. He turned to Blind. I once thought faith was fire, that it must burn in order to live. And now I think it's memory, and memory doesn't need gods. Far away, across the stars, Typhon heard the echo. So did Lucius. So did a fragment of Fulgrim, twisted beyond recognition. So did the dead whisper of Argel Tal, wherever it lingered. They heard the death of a belief that once defined them. And in the eye, the gods screamed. There is a silence that follows death, not of body, but of belief. It does not arrive like a storm. It seeps in grain by grain until what once roared now whispers, and what once whispered now fades entirely. And yet, in that quiet, something else grows, something more dangerous. Memory. Across Syax, the last remnants of Lorgar's broken church were no longer burying the old ways, they were rewriting them. Not with dogma, not with law, but with witness. The pilgrims no longer spoke of salvation. They spoke of what had been survived. Not the gods, not the war, but belief itself. Blind had once memorized entire canticles of the word-bearers' sacred texts, each syllable a dagger against doubt. Now he tore them apart by hand, He burned the books not in rage, but in grief, not one of vengeance, but of understanding. Each ash-stained page that drifted into the dark was another tether cut, another chain released. Yet he felt no liberation, only weight, as if knowledge lost had its own gravity. And in that weight he began to hear it, a voice that had no mouth, a prayer that had no name. It came in dreams, in echoes. It was not his, it was theirs. At first, Blind thought it was the warp bleeding back through the cracks. The scar beneath Syax was alive again, though not with demons. It pulsed with intent, a pressure that pressed against the soul, a hum that throbbed behind the bones of the eye. He asked Lorgar about it. Lorgar did not answer. He had grown quieter since the child thing vanished, not cold, but inward, as if retreating from something he'd seen in the confrontation, as if the voice had not spoken its final word. He spent his hours walking the temple's remains in silence, watching the pilgrims, watching what they built from the ruins of his words, watching, not guiding. He no longer preached. He only listened. And still the prayer came. Blind was the first to hear its shape, then others. A mother nursing her child by the steps of the atrium murmured it between breaths, unknowing. A former priest who had sworn off liturgy began humming it while scrubbing the temple floors. It was not a sermon. It was not doctrine. It was echo, a phrase with no clear origin, yet somehow rooted in the marrow of every being on Syax. Words that none remembered learning, yet none could forget. We are the remnants of fire. We do not burn for gods. We burn for what comes after. Lorgar finally broke his silence. Do you hear it too? Blind nodded. What is it? A prayer, Lorgar said, eyes distant. But not mine. Blind hesitated. Then whose? Lorgar closed his eyes. I don't know. But it's old, older than the gods we named. That's impossible. No, Lorgar murmured. It's worse. It's forgotten. They tried to trace it, this echo prayer that refused to die. It wasn't warp-born. It didn't scream with chaos. It didn't twist the mind. It simply was. Present in thought, present in voice, spoken in solitude and somehow heard by others. Pilgrims began writing it in the dirt, on shattered columns, on the walls of the ruined sanctum. They didn't know why. They didn't even mean to. It was as if the words had a gravity of their own. Lorgar watched as it spread, his expression unreadable. This is how gods are made, he finally whispered, not by conquest, not by miracles, but by memory that refuses to die. The prayer had no name, but it had weight, a power that did not demand loyalty but attention, a resonance that did not compel submission, but participation. It was not a call to war, nor peace. It was not about what to believe. It was about what had survived belief. Blind stood with Lorgar at the edge of the scar, watching it pulse again, deep and blue, like the eye of something vast and waking. What if we didn't silence the gods? Blind asked quietly. What if we only made room for something else? Lorgar's silence was long. Then we must decide whether to kneel again. In the eye of terror, others heard it. Mortarion in his garden of rot paused mid-incantation, his breath catching in lungs that no longer needed to breathe. Fulgrim, fragmented and wild, screamed in artless fury as the echo threaded through his debauched symphony, a note of dissonance he could not extinguish. Even Abaddon, aboard the bridge of the vengeful spirit, looked up from his council of war and frowned, something passing through him like a shadow of memory, a prayer with no god, a prayer that could not be killed. The Pantheon noticed, not just that it spread, but that it grew without them. This was not heresy, this was evolution, and it terrified them. For what are gods but ideas that refuse to die? And what happens when mortals begin creating new ones, not in devotion but in defiance? Korn bellowed. Slanesh wept. Nurgle laughed. Tzeentch began to rewrite the future, and found it no longer listened. Back on Syax, the pilgrims no longer called themselves word-bearers. They did not call themselves anything at all. They had no banners, no colors, no leaders. Only a phrase shared like a whisper. We burn for what comes after. And still Lorgar watched. Somewhere deep within, the seed of something stirred. Not ambition, not hunger. Possibility. He turned to Blind. This is no longer my war. No, Blind said, but it began with you. And how does it end? I don't think it does, Blind replied. I think that's the point. That night, as the stars wheeled overhead in strange, impossible geometries, Lorgar returned to the altar. The blank book lay open. Its pages were full now, not with his words, with theirs, with the voices of the lost, the broken, the freed. He touched the cover and felt the pulse beneath it, the same pulse as the scar, as the whispering prayer. Not a god, not a lie, just a truth waiting to be remembered. And somewhere, deep in the warp, something new began to wake. It had no face, it had no hunger, it had no promise of power, it had only witness. And the final words Lorgar spoke that night, unheard by any but the stars. Let this be the last prayer I write. It began as dust, not warp dust, not ash from holy texts or the crumbling bones of forgotten saints. Just dust, earth, broken stone, wind-blown, and soft. It gathered in the hollow place at the center of the ruined temple on Syax, where once Lorgar had knelt before the gods and then renounced them. There was no ceremony, no declaration, only a circle cleared by feet that did not intend to create one. Only silence, marked not by absence but by presence. This was the shrine, not to Lorgar, not to chaos, but to what remained after belief died screaming. Blind stood in the center of the dust ring. Around him, the remnants of the faithful sat, not worshipping, not listening, just being. It felt wrong, and it felt right. Do you know why we're here? He asked aloud, to no one. A woman missing half her jaw smiled gently and gestured to the sky. A former space marine of the word-bearers, helmless and scarred beyond recognition, gave a small shrug. They didn't have an answer. That was the answer. The shrine refused definition. They tried to give it one. A few pilgrims tried to raise an altar. It collapsed in the night. Some tried to place relics at its center, pages of the Book of Lorgar, icons of the Long War, shattered helms of dead Astartes. By morning, they were gone. Not stolen, just gone. Like the place itself rejected being owned. Lorgar came to see it himself, and when he looked upon it, his face did not twist in anger. It broke into a quiet smile. It learned faster than I did, he said. Blind nodded. It doesn't want to be worshipped. It wants to remember. Memory had become the new currency of belief. The shrine became a place where no prayers were offered, but every sorrow was spoken. A child orphaned by the Black Crusades came to the ring and told the story of her mother's last breath. An old serf who once fed the word-bearers aboard the infidus Imperator recited the names of each legionnaire he'd watched lose himself to the warp. Even Blind spoke one night, voice shaking. He did not tell the story of faith. He told the story of what came after faith. And Lorgar listened, always listened, never interrupting, never correcting. As if he too was learning how to remember without rewriting. The Imperium noticed, not through data or auspex scans, through silence. A sector that should have screamed with warp storms now lay still. A dozen minor shrines to chaos fell quiet, unexplained. Several warbands reported hallucinations, echoes of voices praying to no god. Inquisitors grew nervous. They dispatched observation ships cloaked in shadow, orbiting Syax recording transmissions. The whispers reached Terra. The Shrine of Dust, they called it. Some thought it a trick, some a psyker anomaly. Others whispered of a fifth force, neither Imperium nor Chaos, Xenos nor Machine, but something else, a memory that refused to be forgotten. Abaddon sent an emissary, a word-bearer once loyal to Lorgar, now devout only to the War Master's long war. He arrived in fire. He came to Syax not with questions, but judgment. You speak of no gods, he spat at the gathering. You speak of no war. You speak of nothing. Blind stepped forward calmly. We speak of what remains. The emissary sneered. You speak of rot. Perhaps, Lorgar said, emerging from the shadows behind him. But it is not the kind you know. The emissary turned, eyes wide. I am not your prophet anymore, Lorgar said softly. You're not a prophet at all, the word-bearer growled. No, Lorgar agreed, but I remember how one dies. They expected violence, but none came. The emissary stared long at the Shrine of Dust, then back to Lorgar, and then he turned without another word and left. He burned nothing. He cursed nothing. The silence had unmade him, not with force, but with reflection. He would report back, and the gods would hear, and they would fear. Blind spoke later that night. What happens when they come to tear it down? They'll try, Lorgar said, but it won't work. You sound sure. I am. Why? Because it's not a place, Lorgar said. Not anymore. He touched his chest. It's here, in them, in us. The shrine isn't what we built. He looked to the pilgrims. It's what they carry. The whisper prayer changed, not in words, but in tone. It grew, not louder, but deeper. People began to respond to it, not in speech, but in action. A dying remembrancer from a shattered warfleet asked to be brought to the shrine. She could no longer speak, but when her fingers touched the dust, she smiled. A chaos cultist captured by a rogue traitor fled her captors, clawed her way to the shrine, and died whispering, "It was never about the gods." A tech priest of Mars, stripped of his machine enhancements, stood at the shrine and wept oil-tinged tears. The shrine didn't promise peace. It promised presence. That was enough. One night, Lorgar entered the circle alone. He stood in the center, where once the gods had spoken to him in visions of fire and damnation. He closed his eyes, and he did not pray. Instead, he said, I am sorry. Not to the gods, not to the galaxy, but to himself. For every lie I mistook for truth, for every truth I carved into someone else's skin, for the worship I demanded when I should have listened. He looked to the sky. I thought I was the voice. He placed a hand on the ground, but I was only ever the echo. The Shrine of Dust had no walls. It had no clergy. And yet, pilgrims came. From forgotten corners of the eye, from lost worlds too small to be conquered, from warbands shattered by madness, bearing memories instead of bolters, and they told their stories. Not for salvation, but so they would not vanish. So the truth, fractured and ugly and real, would not be drowned in a tide of sermons and sigils. Lorgar sat among them now, not above, and wrote nothing. There were no new books. There were only witnesses. And in the silence between stories, the prayer kept moving. We are the remnants of fire. We do not burn for gods. We burn for what comes after. Not all came to understand. Some sought to burn it down. They failed, not because the shrine fought back, because it refused to be seen by those who could not listen. They saw only dust, only ruins. They found nothing worth destroying. And they left, confused, angry. The shrine remained. Blind found Lorgar watching the stars one evening, face lit by the shimmer of distant galaxies. "Do you miss it?" Blind asked. "The power?" "Number the certainty." Lorgar was quiet for a long time. Then, "Yes." Another pause. "But I trust the uncertainty more than I ever trusted the gods." Blind nodded. "What do we do now?" "We remember," Lorgar said, "and we listen." At the edge of the shrine, a new figure arrived. He wore no armor, he bore no heraldry, but his eyes were deep with memory. He knelt in the dust. He whispered no name, and yet Lorgar's breath caught. For he knew the man. He had once been his brother. He didn't say who he was. He didn't need to. The silence that followed his arrival was deeper than reverence, thicker than fear. It was recognition. The man who entered the shrine of dust bore no insignia, no armor, no entourage. He was not robed in glory, nor cloaked in mystery. He simply was, like a figure remembered from a dream, not in detail, but in weight. Lorgar stood slowly, his face unreadable. His hands did not tremble, but his soul did. The figure knelt in the dust, placed a hand to the bare ground, and whispered a single word. Not a prayer, not a name, just brother. It was Magnus, but not the Crimson King, not the monstrous demigod who had warred with reality. This was the man beneath the Titan, eyes tired, shoulders bent with invisible chains, hair shorn to the scalp, no trace of the third eye, as if he'd torn the warp from himself strand by strand. He did not rise immediately. He simply knelt, head bowed, for what felt like a century. Lorgar approached. No weapons, no wards, just history walking toward history. "I didn't think you would come," Lorgar said softly. "I didn't think you'd still be you," Magnus replied. And then, finally, they embraced. The pilgrims did not cheer. They did not bow. They watched. They had learned from the shrine itself. Silence could be louder than speech. Blind moved among them, calming those whose instincts spoke of power, danger, old trauma. "Do not fear him," he said quietly. "He's not here to rule." Magnus spoke that night, not as a primarch, not as a king, but as a survivor. His voice carried not with force, but weight. He sat in the dust with Lorgar and Blind, surrounded by the flame-lit faces of the broken faithful. "I saw a vision," Magnus said. "Not a warp vision, something older." He tapped his chest. "Here, in the place where the eye doesn't reach." The crowd leaned forward. "In the vision, I stood on Terra, and there were no temples, no thrones, just ruins, a garden growing through bones." He looked at Lorgar. "And I wept. Not because it had fallen, but because it had finally stopped lying to itself." Lorgar nodded. "I saw something similar, only mine was fire." "That makes sense," Magnus said, half smiling. "You always needed to burn it down to see what was underneath." "And you always wanted to read the ashes." They both laughed. It was quiet, tired laughter. The crowd did not know what to do with it, but they did not interrupt. These were not gods speaking, just men, ruined men. Magnus turned to Blind. "You lead this?" "No," Blind said. "I listen." Magnus studied him. No armor, no name, no doctrine, and yet they follow. They remember. What? That they were human. Once, Magnus nodded. He closed his eyes. "I miss that." He stayed. Not for a night, not for a season, for years. He taught no doctrines, he gave no commands, he built nothing. He simply listened, told stories, cleaned the bones of the dead, helped cook. Once he repaired a broken shrine lamp using his hands, not sorcery. The pilgrims stopped fearing him, some even forgot who he was. He was just the tall red man who slept under the stars and cried when children sang. One night, he asked Lorgar a question. "Do you ever think Father knew it would end like this?" Lorgar stared at the stars. Number. He was too proud. Then why do I still dream of him? Because we never stopped wanting to be sons. The Shrine of Dust had changed. Not in shape, still just the circle, still just the silence, but in gravity. Pilgrims came from even farther now, not because they hoped for miracles, but because they knew nothing would be demanded of them. No gods, no litanies, just memory and presence, and maybe, if they were lucky, the chance to be heard. The word-bearers declared the shrine heretical. Irony, Lorgar mused, truly had no limits. They sent a warband of zealots, ragged with warp-burn and scripture-choked. They arrived screaming, but found no one to fight. The shrine was empty when they came. Just dust, just wind. They left confused. Then, the shrine reappeared, as if it had never been a place, but a moment, and the zealots had missed it. One day, Magnus brought a child to the circle. She had no eyes, born blind in a radiation-crippled hive, but she saw more clearly than most. She walked the circle and pointed to invisible scars. "This is where the lie was buried," she said, standing near Lorgar's old place. "And here," she turned, pointing to where Magnus often sat, "is where memory started to heal." She looked up at them both. "Will it stay healed?" Magnus smiled sadly. "No," he said, "but it will scar, and scars remember." Blind died. No drama, no prophecy. He simply did not wake. They buried him at the edge of the circle, not with stone, but with dust. And in the place he used to sit, they placed his boots. Never filled. Just there. Lorgar sat beside them every evening for a year. Magnus sat beside him. Neither spoke. There was no sermon. The shrine did not need one. Time passed. Seasons came and went. The galaxy spun on in war, screaming, blind. But Syax remained silent. Outside factions tried to claim the world. None succeeded, not because it was defended, but because every invasion force forgot why they came. Some called it a warp anomaly, some a trick, but those who truly listened knew the shrine had outlived the gods. And then, one night, Lorgar stood again at the center of the circle. He was older, his skin dimmed, his voice cracked, but he stood tall. He looked to Magnus and whispered, "It's time." "For what?" Magnus asked. "To stop being remembered." Magnus frowned. Lorgar explained, "As long as I live, they'll look at me as a symbol, an echo of an echo, a reminder of war." Magnus nodded slowly. "But if I go, the shrine remains what it should be." He smiled. "Not about me." No grand ritual marked his departure. He walked into the storm plains beyond the shrine, alone, left all things behind. Even his name. They found only a robe in the morning, folded, dust-covered. Magnus did not cry. He did not speak. He simply sat. And the next night, when a new pilgrim came, frightened, limping, blood on their hands, Magnus smiled, patted the dust beside him, and said, "Sit. The gods can wait. You matter more." They came not with bolters, not with banners, not with oaths, nor curses, nor threats scrawled in blood and scripture. They came in silence, like the falling of ash before fire. Inquisitors, 3 of them, cloaked in obsidian and red, their armor marked not by the Aquila, but by the question it once represented. Why must this be so? The Ordo Apathia, rare, heretical to some, apostates to others. They did not burn heresy. They observed it. They did not judge. They listened. And then they decided, alone, cold, beyond the veil of man. Syax did not resist. How could it? There were no defenses, no walls, no creed, just dust, memory, and the remnants of men who once thought they could reshape the stars. Magnus waited for them, Not in defiance, in patience. He brewed them tea. "Do you know what this place is?" the eldest inquisitor asked, accepting the clay cup. Magnus did not answer directly. "Do you know?" The woman sipped. Bitter roots, ash leaf, star tea. She winced, then smiled. "No." She set the cup down gently. "That's why we're here." The middle inquisitor, a man with artificial lungs and eyes like broken glass, walked the circle with his auspex spinning in frustration. "No warp signatures," he muttered. "No psychic interference. No holy relics, no unholy ones, no data, no threat." He sounded almost disappointed. The youngest inquisitor, little more than a boy by their standards, sat near Blind's boots. He said nothing for hours, just stared. Magnus sat beside him eventually. After a while, the boy spoke. "Is this what peace looks like?" Magnus didn't answer. Instead, he said, "It's what comes after peace." The oldest inquisitor summoned Magnus by firelight. They sat alone. Pilgrims watched from afar, unsure whether history was ending or beginning again. "I read your past," she said. Magnus nodded. "You've done terrible things." "Yes." She tilted her head. "You regret them?" "No." Her eyes narrowed. "Why not?" "Because regret is a mirror that never lets you leave the room. I broke mine a long time ago." She was silent for a time, then said, "Do you believe in the Emperor?" Magnus stared into the fire. "I did." "And now?" "I believe he was a man, a great one, a terrible one, but still, a man." The Inquisitor leaned back. "That's a dangerous belief." Magnus smiled. "It's a healing one." They stayed 3 days, interviewed pilgrims, walked the circle, ate the dust bread, drank silence like wine. They found no heresy, no worship, no ideology, only remembrance. When they left, they said nothing, just walked into the dusk. The youngest turned once, looked back at Magnus, and whispered, "Thank you." Magnus did not respond. The shrine did not notice. It had outlived inquisitors before. It would outlive them again. The arrival of the silent choir was not so gentle. Warp echoes preceded them. 13 beings wrapped in living bronze, faces masked in blank steel, psychers whose tongues had been cut at birth. Their thoughts screamed louder than sermons. The earth groaned when they landed. The sky dimmed. Magnus stood and waited at the circle's edge. "I thought you had all died," he said calmly. They said nothing. They did not need to. Their presence was enough. Old allies, former sons, forgotten betrayers, created by the new ecclesiarchy of the shattered Imperium Nihilus. Their task: erasure. They moved toward the circle, slow, deliberate. One placed a hand on the shrine of dust. The ground recoiled. Something old beneath the surface growled, not in anger, but in sorrow. The choir prepared to unmake the place. Magnus stepped into the center and spoke. No spells, no screams, just truth, louder than any power, stronger than any ward. "I am not here to save the past," he said. "I am here to remember that it happened." The choir halted. One tilted its head. Magnus continued. "You want to erase this place because it terrifies you." He pointed, not because of what it says, but because of what it refuses to say. The choir's minds burned like black suns, but Magnus was older than fire, older than ruin. He had been broken, reshaped, and found no gods at the end of it. Only memory. "I buried my father here," Magnus whispered. Not physically, not literally, but truly. The choir stepped back and vanished, not in fear, but in understanding. Their war was elsewhere. This place was no longer part of it. Time unraveled strangely on Syax. Some pilgrims swore they stayed only days, returned to find years had passed. Others claimed they spent lifetimes there, only to return home and find the same sunrise waiting. Magnus aged, or maybe he didn't. The circle remained, unchanged, but full of ghosts. A woman came once, wrapped in armor too old to function. She bore a blade that wept, a Thousand Suns dagger reversed, hilt shaped like a scarab, rusted beyond use. She asked no questions, just sat beside Magnus. Was he real? She asked. Who? Lorgar, blind. You. Magnus looked at her. What does it matter? She nodded slowly. Just wanted to know if I dreamed it. He reached out, touched her shoulder. You did, she cried, not because she believed, because she remembered. The shrine attracted no more armies, only wanderers, the insane, the redeemed, the tired, the ones who had seen too much of war and wanted to know what came after. One man came bearing a melted Aquila. He whispered, I killed for the Emperor, then fell silent for 6 days. On the 7th, he whispered, I want to live for myself. And he did. He built a garden beside the circle. Nothing grew, but he tended it anyway. One day, the stars shifted. The light turned red. The black tithe began again across the galaxy, whole sectors harvested for flesh and soul. A warp maelstrom bloomed in the galactic north. The Tyranids changed. The Necrons rose. The Imperium redivided. But Syax remained a ghost. It was no longer a planet. It was a punctuation mark in the sentence of history. A pause, a breath, a refusal to forget. Magnus sat at the circle, alone. Older now, or maybe younger. He stared at the place where Lorgar had once sat, where Blind had once sung. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not to gods, not to spirits, just to memory itself. Don't let them forget, he said, and the wind answered, we won't. There are no more sermons, no more crusades, no more litanies of hate. The galaxy screams, yes. It tears itself open with tooth and ruin, yes. But here, on the dust world of Syax, there is only silence. And yet, in that silence, something grows. Not belief, not empire, but meaning. Magnus walked the circle each morning, not as a ritual, not as penance, but as a way to remember the shape of footsteps, the size of his shadow, the feel of the ground beneath his heel. One day he stopped walking. He simply stood, and then he knelt and pressed his hand against the dirt, not to cast a spell, not to search for answers, but to feel that the galaxy had not yet vanished beneath abstraction, to feel that something real still existed. The pilgrims noticed. They began to kneel too, not in worship, in understanding. No hierarchs led them, no doctrines were spoken. They just knelt beside a broken Primarch and felt the dust in their hands. Some stayed for an hour, others for days. All left changed. One night, a comet passed overhead. It bled light across the sky like a wound in time. A girl asked Magnus if it was a sign. He looked up and shook his head. No, he said. It's a comet. She frowned. Then what does it mean? He paused and answered. That meaning must come from you, not me, not the stars, not him. He pointed upward. She looked confused. You mean the Emperor? He smiled faintly. I mean whoever you think is listening. The girl came back years later, older, eyes sharper, armor scorched. She was a fighter now, maybe a leader. She did not kneel. She stood at the edge of the circle and said, I made meaning. Magnus looked up from the dust. She held out a book. Not a holy one, a journal. Inside, names, drawings, stories, small deaths, quieter births, the lives of the forgotten. I wrote them down, she said, so someone would know they mattered. Magnus took the book, held it as if it were gold. You are wiser than I ever was, he said. She laughed. I learned from your mistake. Syax changed, not in landscape, in intention. It became not a shrine, nor a temple, nor a relic. It became a library of the human soul, one built not of data, but of presence. Stories were whispered into the stones, buried in glass jars beneath the dust, carved into the bones of trees that refused to die. Not sacred, just true. Then, one day, the stars came to listen. Not men, not monsters, but others. The first were Necron, 2 of them. Warriors, numbered librarians. They said nothing, but walked the circle in slow alien grace. Magnus greeted them. They responded by laying down a single data shard. It pulsed with green light. Inside it, not war plans, but poetry, pre-fall poetry. They left it on the dust and departed, not as conquerors, as mourners. The second were Eldar, a lone seer, mask cracked, armor thin. She sat at the edge of the circle and cried, said she had seen this place in a vision before her craft world died, that a red giant would weep among the ashes, that she was meant to witness it, that here everything would end correctly. Magnus gave her a place, beside the fire. She died there, weeks later. Her soul did not scream. It sighed. Even the Tyranids came, not in hunger, in confusion. A scout creature wandered into the circle one dusk. It should have devoured. It did not. It stood still. Then turned and left. Some pilgrims swore it bowed before Magnus. Others said it merely understood there was nothing left to consume. Nothing but memory. And Tyranids do not eat memory. The last visitors were the most terrible. They wore black armor flecked in gold, the Xanthine Scions, once loyal to chaos undivided, now loyal to nothing. They arrived in silence, 10 of them. They bore relics of both faith and science, warp and logic, chaos and order. They stood at the edge of the circle and said, "We have no gods left." Magnus nodded. "I know. We want to know what comes after." Magnus gestured to the dust. "Then begin here." One of them wept, not for pain, not for regret, but for the relief of no longer lying, of no longer pretending that belief could protect them from meaninglessness, of no longer fearing the silence between stars. Years passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no authority here, only rhythm, only memory. Magnus began to forget faces, not out of age, but because so many had come, too many to name, too many to hold. He buried their names beneath stones, whispered them once before covering them, not to erase, to shelter, to keep the wind from stealing them. On the final day, a child arrived, small, blind in one eye. He carried a single word scrawled on a scrap of synth paper. It was not in Gothic, not in High Chthonian, not even in any human language. It was a new word, one without translation. The boy held it up. Magnus took it, read it, smiled, and for the first time in centuries, he cried, not in grief, not in rage, in completion. The shrine had taught him nothing new, only reminded him of what he had always known, that the word of Lorgar was not a weapon. It was not a lie. It was not even a truth. It was a question. What will you choose to believe? Magnus closed his eyes for the last time. The wind buried him where he knelt. No tomb, no sarcophagus, just dust. And in the center of the circle, a small stone. Upon it, only one inscription he remembered. It began as a whisper. In the black cathedral ship Admonisher of Faith, buried deep within the warp-lost sectors beyond the eye, a voice stirred in the stillness. It was not the voice of Lorgar. Not anymore. It was older, worse. It did not command. It did not threaten. It simply waited. And Lorgar, once a god-touched prophet, now an unloved echo of his own scripture, waited beside it. For what? for permission, number for silence to break. But the voice did not speak, not because it was cruel, but because it no longer cared. The gods of chaos do not abandon their servants. They outlive them. That is worse. To be beneath notice is more damning than to be destroyed. Lorgar had preached the long truth, had raised empires, torn down pantheons, shattered brothers and bastions alike. He had been the first to kneel, and now he was last to be forgotten. He wandered the cathedral alone. Statues lined the halls, versions of himself at different stages of faith. The young prophet, eyes wide with devotion. The dark saint, wreathed in fire and truth. The penitent, cracked open by his own gospel. Each wore his face. Each lied. In truth, Lorgar looked nothing like these icons now. His armor rusted beneath skin that shifted with the seasons of the warp. His eyes were dim, not blind, but weary. He did not chant. He did not pray. He watched. One night, or perhaps one warp century later, he stood before the reliquary of Erebus. The apostle's skull had been kept here since the Wars of Ash. He had not wept when Erebus died. Now he did. Not for Erebus, but for the boy who had once believed him. "Why do you cry?" The voice came from behind him, a soft voice, familiar. Lorgar turned and saw himself, not a vision, not a clone, not a demon, just a boy, younger, simpler, before it all, before chaos, before faith, before the Emperor. The boy looked up at him, eyes full of wonder, of questions. "You were me," the boy said. Lorgar said nothing. The boy stepped closer. "Why did we do it?" Still nothing. "Why did we destroy so much?" Lorgar finally answered, "Because we thought it was the only way to make sense of the pain." The boy nodded and placed something in Lorgar's hand, a broken symbol, the Aquila, but one half was missing. "It was never whole," the boy said. Lorgar looked at it, felt its weight, felt the emptiness in it. He whispered, "And yet I thought I could complete it, with fire, with words, with blood." The boy tilted his head. "And did you?" Lorgar closed his eyes. "No." The boy vanished. The cathedral was silent again, but Lorgar could no longer bear that silence, so he did something he had not done in 10,000 years. He prayed. Not to chaos, not to the Emperor, to nothing, to the void, to whatever might still be listening at the edge of entropy. He spoke not in sermon, but in confession. "I do not know if I am evil or if I was ever good. I do not know if I served gods or merely fed them. I do not know what my words meant or if they only served to destroy meaning for others. But I know this. I still want to be heard." There was no answer. Only the flickering of dead starlight through the stained glass dome above him. He knelt beneath it, like he once had in the ashes of Monarchia. But this time, he did not kneel for punishment. He knelt because he was tired. Tired of being a symbol. Tired of being right. Tired of being the architect of faith that broke the galaxy's spine. He whispered to no one, "I thought belief was power, but it was a cage, and I built it, brick by brick, with scripture and fire." The air did not respond, but the cathedral trembled. Something moved. Not a god, not a demon, but the memory of faith itself. It surged through the walls, not wrath, not salvation, just presence. Lorgar stood and walked to the great pulpit for the last time. He looked down at the empty pews, where once millions knelt. Now only dust, and in that dust, etched by some long-dead acolyte, were the words, "He taught us to kneel, but never to rise." Lorgar read the words, and then he did something impossible. He laughed, a raw, broken laugh, not mocking, not cruel, but real. He whispered, "I was never a god. I was never even a prophet. I was a man afraid of silence, and so I screamed my faith into the void, hoping it would scream back." He turned from the pulpit, and for the first time since the heresy, he left the cathedral, not in chains, not in fire, but in peace. Outside, the warp was quieter now. Still mad, yes, still dangerous, but beneath the madness was an echo of what he had forgotten. Choice, the not destiny, not fate, but choice. He whispered, "If there is still a future, it must be made by those who do not kneel, who do not seek gods, but meaning." In the distance, a light blinked, a real sun. Not warp light, not demonic illusion, a real untainted system. He walked toward it, armor crumbling, faith abandoned, but self intact. For the first time in millennia, Lorgar walked not to spread truth, but to listen for it. And far behind him, the cathedral whispered its final hymn. He left no gospel, only questions. The galaxy turned. It always did. Empires collapsed, stars dimmed, gods rose and fell in the shadow of their own worship. But still the stars turned, and in one forgotten corner of that turning expanse, a single Primarch walked beneath a real sky. Lorgar Aurelian, apostle of the word, prophet of the gods, architect of the heresy, stepped foot upon an unnamed world where no one bowed and no one remembered him. And it was good. It was a silent world. Not silent as in dead, there were cities low and rusted, hunched beneath the weight of their own survival. There were people, too, pale-eyed, thin, curious, but they had no clergy, no temples, no saints. They did not pray. They worked. They built. They cared. They did not believe. And Lorgar loved them for it. He walked among them as a wanderer, his armor hidden beneath ragged cloth, his face veiled in soot and travel dust. No one recognized him. Even the warp, that coiling storm ever tethered to his soul, had receded from him as if embarrassed by their long companionship. He taught no lessons, preached no truths. He listened to stories, to laughter, to mistakes made without punishment, to life without doctrine. And then, one evening beneath the twin moons, he found it. A boy, no older than 12, was reading by firelight in the ruins of what had once been a library. The book in his hands trembled with ancient glyphs. The binding crackled with cursed ink. Lorgar knew the book. He had written it. Long ago. The Book of Lorgar. He felt his breath catch in his throat. It had survived. Despite the burning of libraries, the collapse of empires, the scouring of heretics, his words, his original words, remained. And the boy read them aloud. "Truth is not a gift," the boy read, "but a punishment we long to deserve." Lorgar stepped closer. "You know what that means?" he asked carefully. The boy blinked up at him, half curious, half afraid. "It's poetry," he said. "Do you understand it?" "No," the boy replied, "but I like the sound of it." Lorgar knelt, and for the first time in centuries, he smiled. The next day, he asked the boy where he'd found the book. "In the ruins," the boy said. "There's a whole vault of them, all strange, all beautiful, some dangerous." Lorgar knew that vault. He had built it himself a long time ago, when the word-bearers still sought to preserve sacred texts during their crusades. But those texts had not been sacred. They had been weapons. Scripture, twisted to bind belief like chains. He went to the vault, and what he found there was not horror, not memory, but possibility. Like the texts were old, some warped by warp fire, some bound in human skin, some etched into glass. All dangerous. But the people here had not worshipped them. They had read them, questioned them, argued with them. They had treated the word not as truth, but as literature. The sacred had become the story, and the story had lost its power to enslave. Lorgar touched the oldest book, the first Codex of the Word, and asked, "Are you still dangerous, if no one fears you?" For weeks, he stayed in the village. Quietly, he helped repair the vault. He taught the children not doctrine, but how to ask better questions. He translated older texts not into worship, but into metaphor. The people laughed, they learned, and the warp, it kept its distance. He felt free. Until the ship arrived. It descended in fire and shadow, black armor, red trim. Word-bearers, real ones, his sons, or rather, what remained of them. He saw the markings, the 8th Host, 2nd Grand Company, once led by Marduk, once loyal to his word. They came not as pilgrims, they came as hunters. They had traced the residual psychic hum of the Book of Lorgar. They believed it sacred still, and now they came to retrieve it and destroy any who had touched it. They did not recognize him. His face, weathered and changed by time, was not the one engraved in their shrines. They saw him only as an old man in rags standing in their way. Their leader stepped forward, a dark apostle tall and burning with fanatic light. He said, "Stand aside, elder. The word does not belong to the mouths of heretics." Lorgar looked at him and felt a great sorrow. He asked, "Why do you still believe?" The apostle sneered. "Because you taught us to." "No," Lorgar whispered. "I taught you to question." The apostle raised his staff, pulsing with warp runes. "You taught us to kneel." Lorgar lowered his head and said, not in power, but in grief, "Then I failed." They attacked, not out of cruelty, but out of love, twisted love, the kind that demands blood when its God stops speaking. But Lorgar did not raise his hand. He did not strike them down with demon fire. He simply stood and let the apostle strike him. The blow landed, his ribs shattered. He fell. The boy screamed, but Lorgar only smiled through blood and cracked teeth. He whispered, "You do not understand the word, but perhaps he will." He looked at the boy, then closed his eyes. The apostle turned to the villagers. "Burn the vault," he commanded. "Cleanse the taint." But the villagers, unarmed, terrified, did not obey. They stood in front of the vault, and the boy stepped forward, holding the book, not like a weapon, like a question. He opened it and read, "Faith is not fire, it is ash, what remains after fire has passed." The apostle froze for just a moment, then turned back to the body of the old man. Lorgar was gone, not vanished, simply absent, like a breath let go. They searched the planet for days, but the apostle could not find the body, nor could he explain why his powers no longer answered, why the warp had gone quiet, why he felt, for the first time, alone. The villagers rebuilt the vault. They protected the books, but they did not worship them. The boy grew, and in time he taught others how to read the Book of Lorgar, not as dogma, but as history. He added his own annotations. He changed the order of some verses. He made it his own. The word lived, but no longer ruled. And far away, in a place beyond the warp, in a garden without name, a figure walked barefoot through soft grass. Not a god, not a demon, just a man. Free at last from the echo of his own voice. He sat beneath a tree and listened, to silence, to wind, to laughter, distant and real. He held a blank book in his hands, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he began to write. Not scripture, not prophecy, just a story. And across the stars, where gods screamed and empires burned, a whisper moved. Not a threat, not a gospel, just a sentence. He is not coming back. But in that sentence, there was peace, because Lorgar Aurelian had left the war, not in defeat, but in choice. The Book of Lorgar was rewritten, not by gods, not by primarchs, by children, and that alone was heresy. Across the stars, the word-bearers fractured. The loss of Lorgar's voice, his final silence, echoed louder than any revelation. He had not ascended. He had not died a martyr. He had walked away, and in doing so, had broken their faith more completely than Guilliman ever could. Some called it betrayal. Others called it liberation. But all agreed the apostle was gone. And in his absence, new voices rose. The eighth host splintered. The apostle who had struck Lorgar, the one once called Vel Korad, retreated into solitude. He wandered the warp-blasted ruins of once great shrines, preaching sermons only to himself, waiting for the voice of the gods to return. It never did. His brothers turned on each other, some following Corfarin's old doctrines, others invoking Erebus's lies, still others crafting new scriptures, fragmenting the word into 1,000 splinters, each shard sharp, each one cutting deeper. The legion cracked. But not all sought war. A small company, just 19 word-bearers, returned to the nameless world where the book had been found. They did not burn the vault. They entered it, and read, and wept, not for the loss of power, but for the clarity of what had been stolen from them for 10,000 years. They laid down their arms, not in surrender, but in mourning. They became its guardians, not preachers, not priests, but librarians. The Imperium noticed, as it always did, an entire legion in disarray. Psychic echoes of a Primarch's disappearance, warp traces that terminated instead of spreading. The Ordo Hereticus called it an opportunity. The Inquisition called it a trap. The Silent Sisterhood called it a reckoning long overdue, and they came, not with torches, with extermination orders. An inquisitorial fleet arrived in orbit over the nameless world. It did not speak. It did not parley. It began orbital bombardment. The villagers ran, the sky screamed, the vault cracked, and the books, centuries old, power-laced, tainted by the warp, began to burn. The boy, now nearly grown, carried as many as he could out of the flames. He was not a soldier. He had no armor, no bolter, no augmetics, just his hands, his memory, and the words. He ran through fire, pulling manuscripts from rubble. He was coughing blood when he found the last book, the one Lorgar had written by hand. Not the first book, the last, the blank one, now filled, not with scripture, but stories. He opened the book as the ceiling collapsed, and he read aloud, even as death approached. He read not to summon a demon, not to call for salvation, but because it was beautiful, and the words mattered, even if no one ever heard them again. The Inquisitor, Magda Veritas Ordo Hereticus Prime, stood on the ash-covered surface hours later. She surveyed the ruins. She expected corruption. She expected demons. She expected madness. What she found were books and children. No sigils, no chants, no worship, just questions, just stories, and among them a burned copy of the Book of Lorgar, annotated in a child's hand. Truth is a conversation, not a command. She paused, and she hesitated, which inquisitors were not meant to do, but Magda Veritas did, because in that moment she remembered a lesson from her own training. The fire that burns too quickly forgets what it meant to protect. She ordered the strike to pause. She walked the ruins herself, and she listened to survivors, to children, to books, and something in her hardened heart began to soften, not enough to pardon, but enough to wonder. The survivors were relocated. Not executed, resettled in a library world on the edge of Segmentum Pacificus, a quiet place, unimportant, forgotten, perfect for something new. The vault's contents were scattered through data vaults, translated and stored, not as heresy, but as history. And in time, the boy became the curator of a new archive. Not a temple, not a fortress, a school. He taught others to read the words of the past, not to worship them, to argue with them, to see Lorgar not as a god, but as a warning, and maybe a man who tried to make things right. Elsewhere, the gods raged. They had lost another son, another tool, another voice, and they did not understand why, because gods cannot comprehend silence, and Lorgar had chosen it. On a world where time no longer moved, where the warp had no dominion, a man sat beneath a tree. The book in his hands was full, the ink still wet. He turned the last page and saw something strange, a blank page at the end. He blinked, then smiled. He understood. The story never ends. It is passed on. It is rewritten. It becomes what the next mind makes of it. He set the book down and walked away. Back in the material galaxy, rumors spread that Lorgar had been seen in a refugee camp on Thaur, that he walked the deserts of Necromunda barefoot and laughing, that a veiled man in tattered robes debated the ecclesiarchy in the gutters of Terra itself. No proof ever surfaced, no records held, but the stories persisted, because stories once begun do not die. They echo, even after their authors are gone. And so the galaxy turned. Faith did not vanish, but it changed. It became a conversation, a question. A path walked with open eyes, and in the shadow of Lorgar's silence, something strange began to grow. Wisdom, not from gods, not from primarchs, from people, from doubt, from choice. You asked me once if I believed in the gods. I don't, but I believe in you, and that was enough to damn me, and enough to save me. Last line of the letter to Lorgar, author unknown. The galaxy did not notice when Lorgar died, if he died at all. There were no warp storms, no shrieking demons, no falling stars, no shrines collapsed, no armies wept, no heralds screamed. He simply disappeared from the eyes of gods and mortals alike. And this, more than anything else, made him dangerous, because Lorgar Aurelian, once the most devout of all the Emperor's sons, had walked out of the story and refused to return. What was left behind? A cracked legion, a faith without a head, a legacy soaked in 10,000 years of blood, but also books, memories, fragments, and, in the ruins of that vast, broken empire of belief, choice. The word-bearers did not die. Some vanished into the eye, seeking old gods with new names. Some tore off their warplate and lived as hermits. Some killed themselves, unable to reconcile the lie with the man who had walked away from it. A few remained warriors, but not for gods. For people, they fought not to spread truth, but to protect the right to seek it. They stopped preaching and began listening. Centuries passed. The Imperium forgot. The Inquisition buried the records, too dangerous, too complicated, too human. The ecclesiarchy whispered of the Aurelian heresy, but few knew its source. Some said he'd been a false prophet. Others claimed he had never existed, a primarch erased by his own silence. But his words remained, in margins, in footnotes, in dreams, and in questions whispered by those who had once burned heretics and now wondered, what if he was right? A girl on a hive world found a book with no cover and too many voices. She read it by glow globe in secret, and it made her cry, not because it promised salvation, but because it didn't. It just told the truth, or tried to. That mattered more than anything. She grew up to be a teacher, and her students wrote their own books. An Ogren who had seen too much and understood too little came across a vault on a dead moon. He could not read, but he touched the pages anyway, and they made him feel warm and seen. He told the stories to his kin, and they wept and laughed and forgot to be afraid. A custodian, old beyond counting, stood vigil beside the emperor's throne and dreamed of a brother who had once wept in his shadow. The dream never ended. The galaxy moved on, but stories persisted because they are harder to kill than gods and more enduring than monuments. On a planet with no name, in a library with no walls, a single book sits open, no locks, no wards, no chains. The final chapter is blank, waiting. Because truth, Lorgar had learned, is not carved in stone. It is written in pencil, smudged, rewritten, passed from hand to hand. It is not shouted, it is whispered, and it is not holy, it is human. No statue remains of Lorgar, no shrine is built in his name. But in places where the flames of dogma have died down, where the ashes are cool enough to touch, people read and question and argue and wonder, what if he wasn't the villain? What if he wasn't the prophet? What if he was just a man trying to understand what could never be understood? And in those moments, he is remembered. Not worshipped, remembered. Far beyond the rim, past maps, past warp tides and relics, there is a garden. It is not vast. It is not sacred. It is quiet, an orchard of memory. And in that orchard, a robed figure tends to the trees. He does not speak to gods. He does not write new scripture. He just tends. And sometimes he opens the book, reads a line, smiles, and turns the page. Because the war is over, not won, not lost, just over. And what remains is peace, not the kind born of conquest, the kind born of letting go. What is faith? Someone once asked him, and he had answered, it is the question you still ask, even after you have stopped believing in the answer.